I mean, think about it. As Christians, we are fighting a war against the devil himself. We are advancing against the darkest forces of the universe, and we're marching with God on our side. And all the while, all around us, on a dimension that's invisible to our mortal eyes, there are angels and demons and supernatural forces, both good and evil, and they're fighting and they're working to defend and destroy us. And this is all happening all around us. The stakes are infinite. Our souls hang in the balance. We're standing on a battlefield right now as we speak. We are soldiers. Some people demand that we, have evidence outside the Bible. And I think that's kind of silly, personally.
There's no secular argument against adult incest. Brother and sister want to make love. What's your argument? That they're going to produce mentally retarded offspring? It's nonsense.
But let's just say, hypothetically, you got a man who stumbles across a DVD, a laptop that's got a bunch of child porn downloaded on it, and so he watches it. Now, you would probably, even as an atheist, I think you would instinctively say that he's wrong for watching. But why? And it's not hurting anybody. Just as they'll condemn slavery, even when the slavery benefits most people in society. Actually, what we can say is that we'd all end up worse. All of us today would be in a worse spot if slavery never existed at all across the entire globe.
There were undoubtedly many nice slaveholders in the South.
I am me, but I wish I were more than me.
All right. Jason, you're muted. Well, I figures that out.
Yes. Is that taken from actual conversations, or is that just
it's taken from a number of actual conversations. So everything that's in there is real. There's no new sound. It's all stuff that those two guys have said, but it's not that they had this one amazing conversation where they said all of it.
Yeah, I figured it was like mishmash, but I was like, is this AI generated? Because I saw this rapper that's doing this kind of ingenious way to market where he's having AI generated conversations of people like Joe Rogan and Shaq saying that his album is and his song is like the best song ever.
Well, it is.
I thought it was was funny. So I was like, oh, is this the same thing?
No, this is not AI generated. So the audio is all real. There's no, and it's not like they're splicing together, like a word here or whatever. It's all real audio clips. The horrifying Lovecraftian imagery that it's paired with is courtesy of our friend Amon Hawk. So that's Amon Animations. He's been a guest on the show before. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer Jake Abbott and our very talented graphic designer J. Andrew World. About to be his birthday. Go wish him a happy birthday. And I am also joined by one of my very good friends, Jason Myles, who is the host of This Is Revolution podcast. He is a columnist for Sublation magazine. He's a musician, a gadfly, a man about town. So, Jason, how are you doing?
I'm all right, man.
All right.
I'm chilling out here in Mexico. The sun decided to come out right as I was getting ready to do this. Right. So I have to keep my room dark. And by the time this is over, the sun will be gone. So I'm blaming you. It was sunny. And then you came down here and the clouds came. I was like, that MFer brought the goddamn Eeyore clouds with him.
I mean, I know that's what happened in December, at the beginning of my 6 months and living in Baja.
Yeah, literally the gloomiest May and June that the southern region of this country has ever experienced.
Yeah, well, I'll try not to get divorced. I'm going to tell you. But, in any case, we are going to be joined in just a little while by our friend Norm Finkelstein, who is going to be chatting about some recent Supreme Court rulings and about some of the stuff he says in this book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. Looking forward to that as always. I like talking to Norm. I often don't know what he's going to say. That's part of the charm. But before we do anything else, having teased you at the beginning of that, we really should finish watching the video.
I was with it for the infinite stake, and I'm just like, oh, that sounds great, man. Infinite stake. Right here.
A dolphin can't do that. But if there is no God, then this is kind of the entire story of mankind. Man desiring to be free from himself, to be more than what he is, more than material.
The will of man's heart is towards evil from his youth.
If we research to cure doubt, then we're still relying on our own understanding and we're demanding proof. All he needs me to do is just come to the cross, kneel before it, and say, I'm here, Lord. Change me. Although we should always be very careful with that prayer, the change me prayer. He'll do it. He'll do it in ways that you didn't expect.
Babies are not kind. Babies are not murderers, not rapists, but they're not kind. They're pure narcissism. All of life exists for them.
But the question is not whether a thing hurts someone. The question is, why should I care that I hurt someone? Why shouldn't I hurt someone? Why is God hidden? Why is he hidden from us? I'll admit that I've had moments in prayer sometimes where I say to God, God, if you would just reveal yourself. I mean, can you just reveal yourself? Can you come out of the shadows just for 1 second and just show me your glory in all of its fullness, just for 1 second. That's all I'm asking for, just 1 second. But the vision never comes. But what is a woman? You just really don't want to answer the questions, do you?
I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted. And if you do not do all these things immediately, I will ruin your life.
Ever since the beginning of time, teenage girls have been getting pregnant. Girls between the ages of like 17 and 24 is when they're technically most fertile, okay? That's biological. That's a fact, all right? I'm just stating facts. That's all I'm doing. So what I'm saying is that the problem is not per se teenage pregnancy. It's unwed pregnancy. That's the problem in society.
I violate my kids' consent all the time.
Yeah.
That's a rough watch.
Try it on acid.
No, I'm not going to try it on acid for a few reasons, but mostly because I don't know that, my mind would survive that. So I will take a pass on that. Now I will say, forgive me, I suspect that not everybody here finds this as interesting as I do, but I did want to follow up on something that we discussed a couple episodes back, right? So part of it also involves Matt Walsh, one of the participants in that podcast, The Damned, that we just watched. And if people will remember, he had there was this video on the Daily Wire where Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro were getting into it about aliens. And Shapiro is a skeptic, but Walsh is a believer, and overall thought that just by virtue of not thinking that, Shapiro kind of came out of the exchange looking better. But if people will remember, I want to do a correction here, sake of journalistic integrity. People remember when we watched that video, there was one particular point that Shapiro made that we all found very uncompelling. And I will say he made it in the dumbest possible way. But I think there might be more here than I was quite giving him credit for. So if we look at the Ben Shapiro alien clip,
these creatures apparently flew millions of light years to get to planet Earth, where they proceeded to crash their extraordinarily high-tech spacecraft into like a swamp and die. And this seems like wild incompetence. Are these aliens just like extremely good at making their vehicles, but very, very bad at driving them? Are they female aliens? Like, how do we? What's happening here?
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Like that's such a forced racist dad joke that someone of his generation wouldn't think to tell. Like those jokes weren't funny in the mid '80s when they were supposed
I was gonna say, do you think Jay Leno would make that joke? I think that joke
No,
is too hacked for Jay Leno.
Andrew Dice Clay wouldn't have made that joke.
And it's not just Leno wouldn't have made that joke, like later, right? Because he'd get in trouble or whatever. It's that like 1995, Jay Leno wouldn't have made that joke because he would have thought it was too hacky.
1985, Jay Leno wouldn't have made that joke. Like it's not that is some like, take my wife, please. Oh, that's
Yeah. Now again, he's making the point in the dumbest possible way, and he's sort of being gratuitously offensive about how he makes it. I will say I was watching this video from Mick West yesterday that was related to what I just wrote about for the Substack, where I think he actually does make a much better version of this argument, which basically goes something like this: if there are aliens crashing on Earth as often as they're supposed to, like once every few years, then something's really confusing about that, because just in the United States, there are about 45,000 airplane flights a day, and like essentially none of them crash. Like there are plane crashes about as often as there's supposed to be UFO crashes. So,
yeah, I don't that.
This is a much more technologically advanced civilization. I would think that they would be better at, they would be better at building vehicles that had detection systems and stuff to make it harder for them to crash. They would go through this obstacle course. Like remember the first Star Wars movie when Han Solo explains that when you go into hyperspace, you have to make sure you plot.
I would assume it's more like The Last Starfighter, and it's like the training scene in The Last Starfighter.
Okay. To be fair, I'll be the Matt Walsh of this show, only on the topic of aliens. Nothing else. But
I didn't see where this goes.
Yeah.
No, but
self-described Matt Walsh of this show. All right. Let's go.
There's two kind of genres, right, of the UFO. One is like they crashed or I got picked up by them, right, and the other is like I'm like an Air Force pilot who saw something unexplained lights in the distance, and I took video of it and I can't explain it, right? So I thought that the crashing wasn't the only type of UFO sightings that are talked about.
No, it's certainly not. It's a big one, and it's one that came up a lot actually recently because of something that's sort of a combination of those two genres. There's this guy David Grush, you know him? He's a career Air Force officer who ended up sort of climbing up into the intelligence community essentially for the Air Force. He seems to have had this very distinguished career, spent time in Afghanistan and other places he can't disclose, and was eventually for like the Geospatial Agency or something. It's like one of these weird bureaucratic agencies that we don't think about that much. He co-led their UAP task force. UAP means the same thing as UFO. It's unidentified aerial phenomenon. They just switch it from UFO, means exactly the same thing as unidentified flying object, but it doesn't sound as embarrassing to say. So they use that now in all these bureaucratic organizations. And he claims he ran into all this information that convinced him that there are several crashed alien ships that are in possession of the U.S. government. And he's gone through the official procedure to get whistleblower protection so he could talk to Congress. And I watched yeah, so this is the Breaking Points UFO video we've got. So I watched the two hosts of the show, Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, have a argument about this guy, and let's just watch that.
What we have seen is the Pentagon is continuing basically to call him a straight up liar. The Pentagon and the UAP task force, Susan Go, who's one of the spokespeople over there, she came out and she was just like, yeah, this is totally untrue. There's no existence of any of these programs. United States Air Force came out with a statement just being like, yeah, look, ever since Project Blue Book and all of that closed the door, there's no reason that we should even be looking into this. I mean, the cover up is happening in plain sight. The only hope we have are these congressional representatives and whether they're actually going to get to the bottom of it. But I mean, really what we're looking at here is a vast conspiracy of people who have been covering this up now for decades, special access programs, or Grush is straight up psychotic. All these other people that have come forward to Michael Schellenberger and all of that, look, yeah, maybe they're just stone cold crazy. It's very possible. It's certainly possible, but watch the interview. You know, maybe. Look, I've seen hucksters out there before, but this many people, this level of seriousness, the testimony to his character and all of that, the fact that he was vetted by Jeremy Corbell, by Leslie Keane, by Ralph Blumen, these are all people who've met a lot of crazy people out there, you know, before, and they don't just bring these things forward without any recourse. I believe him. I believe him whenever he talks.
So what do you say to, like in Vanity Fair, they were like, okay, you have a track record of a credible person, you have other people who are corroborating your claims, but where's the evidence? You know, where's the photo? Where's the material? Right. Where's the something? Because I do think it's reasonable for people to say, like, okay, this is an unbelievable, like it's a literally unbelievable claim. And so in order for us to take this seriously, you're gonna have to give us a little something more than just some chitty chat. Well, guess what? It's classified. I don't think everybody keeps forgetting that. He has to come forward through the official whistleblower process. He can't just leak classified information. They're gonna lock him up. They're gonna throw him in jail.
Well, I guess we know who the Matt Walsh is in that show.
Okay, I'll just, next time I say that aliens exist, I'll just say I'm that guy. I don't always agree with him, but he's got to be better than Matt Walsh.
I think that Sagar is definitely better than Matt Walsh.
He's at least a better human.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know him particularly. I mean, the other person on the screen is Crystal Ball, friend of mine, friend of the show. The Sagar, I've shared YouTube screens with a few times. I met him briefly at Crystal's wedding. I don't really know him, but like I think like just about anybody, I think the default should be that we assume that they're much better than Matt Walsh. But I do tend to think that he's wrong about this, and that Crystal is making a good point. Because basically the good point she's making, this is what the Substack from yesterday was about. It's called David Hume versus the UFO whistleblower, and the point I was making there is that essentially what Crystal's saying there is like, look, okay, maybe this guy is really trustworthy, but it's a little much. Even with I'm sorry, it's classified, I don't want to get thrown to jail. It's a little much to accept that there are several crashed alien spaceships in the custody of the U.S. government, and he says a bunch of other stuff too. It gets much more out there than that. It's a little much to accept that on the basis of, take my word for it. It's like, I promise I'm not lying to you. Like, it essentially, if you go back and read David Hume's argument in the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding about miracles, essentially his point there is, okay, sure, we believe things all the time on the basis of testimony. Somebody saw it and they tell us. And oftentimes that's a reasonable thing to do. But when somebody is saying that there was like a violation of the laws of physics, like aliens traveled faster than the speed of light and, crashed into the swamp, and then what you have to weigh is, okay, how unlikely do you think it is that somebody who seems real trustworthy would say something that was wrong, versus how unlikely is it that we're wrong about the laws of physics? And it kind of seems like, the second one's going to be more unlikely.
I have a third option.
Okay, what's that?
I have a third option. I was watching a video earlier, asking if aliens are demons. And apparently people who see UFOs are involved in the occult, which makes perfect sense because look at the X-Files. So maybe it's just demons.
I don't care to know the answer. It has never worked out well for the person that has found out the answer. I've watched enough movies that have taken place in the 80s where finding out and investigating has not ended up well. So I will blissfully stay in the dark and stay alive.
Flight of the Navigator is my counterpoint.
I'm gonna give you my
That's
last
one.
take on this. It's not exactly about whether aliens have visited us or not. But one of my closest friends is a left-wing guy, but since he's a straight male, he is a Joe Rogan fan, and he sent me like 6 links. He's like, just watch them and you're gonna believe that UFOs are out there. And I was like, all right. And I haven't watched them yet, so I was like, I'll get to that later. But I was thinking about
we'll revisit this next week.
Yeah,
once you've watched.
yeah. But the majority of Joe Rogan fans, which is the most popular podcast in the world, I think, right? Probably believe that aliens have already visited us. So in terms of like what I don't know how to poll. I mean, maybe there's some Gallup polling on like how many people believe that aliens have visited us now versus like different times in history. But we're in an era, we're talking about like different people talk about like the breakdown of believing in experts, right, or believing in conspiracy theories. We're in an era where like the normal opinion on this, at least among straight men, is going to be that aliens have visited us, whether whatever us eggheads think or whatever David Hume thinks, which is I think it's just an interesting reality to contend with, that this is what the majority of people, or maybe not the majority, but more and more people are believing this, and that's the world that we live in. You know what I mean? And that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'd like to, right? As Fox Mulder would say, right? I'd want to believe. That'd be awesome. I'd love to be wrong about this, but yeah, I think the Humean point seems pretty convincing to me. I also think, like, just on a common sense level, you say, okay, the idea that the U.S. government and all the other governments that would have to be in on it, right, for this to work, would want to cover this up. Never mind be successful in doing so, which they're usually not great at keeping secrets for long periods of time, but. Even they would want to in the first place. Like the sort of classic motivation in all those movies Jason is talking about and in the X-Files and all that is, there would be mass panic if people found out. We can't have that. Mm-hmm. To which I would say, I don't know, man, when has the military-industrial complex ever disliked mass panic?
I just don't want to have Robert Englund in V. I don't know if you remember the scene where Diana eats was it the rat?
Yeah. The hamster. It's like
the hamster or something. Yeah. Like someone on Twitter posted the V action figures, and they had removable faces to show their lizard face. And 8-year-old me saw that. I was like, "That's so cool." And then now I'm on this show, and 45-year-old me is like, "I don't want to meet that in real life."
Well, there's no good transition, but Norm is backstage, so we should begin into the main event for tonight. Jake and Andy, we'll see you guys in the postgame for GTAA patrons. Remember, if you're not a patron yet, it's patreon.com/Ben Burgis, so you can get access to that. Meanwhile,
I'm a patron.
Yep, Jason's a patron. All the coolest people are. So meanwhile, we are joined by the author of this book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. Heretical Thoughts and Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom. Norman Finkelstein.
Norm!
Hi, guys. How are
you? Got the tea on tonight. It must be hot. Is it hot in New York?
It's both hot and I'm old-fashioned. I don't use air conditioners or fans.
That's old-fashioned? That's just cheap. Which one is it?
I won't answer that question.
So now we know we can't go to Norm's hot ass house during the summer.
Because your show may be canceled for anti-Semitism. And I might concur with that position.
Well, how are you this evening?
Well, I'm glad summer finally came because June was awful. It was basically April or October weather, however you read the calendar. But July, things, at least for now, are in sync with my childhood. So I'm grateful for that.
Oh, that's fireworks.
Yes. This is Coney Island, where Dominicans.
Like, does Norm live in the south side of the Bronx?
I once lived in Washington Heights for 8 years. I would say, along with my tenure debacle, I would regard that as one of the most powerful periods of my life.
Did you feel like you was in a Charles Bronson movie?
Well, if you're into salsa and merengue 24/7, 365, it's a sheer joy. And if you like people playing their salsa merengue by putting their speakers in the windows so that their brethren in the Dominican Republic can hear the music live, then you will be very happy to live in Washington Heights. But if you're a Jew who likes quiet, I won't continue because I might get canceled for anti-Semitism.
That's one of the things that I enjoy about living here in Mexico. I used to live in a music rehearsal and recording studio in Oakland, and every music you don't want to hear at any hour of the day or night is what you sign up to listen to. And that's what I signed for like 6 years. That's what I signed up to listen to. So I hate a lot of, Ben will tell you, whenever I hear, like, if I'm not going to a live music show, which is usually just to see a friend or something, I'm worse than you.
Look,
yeah, I'm always like going to see live music on purpose. Great. Going to like get coffee, have dinner, and having surprise live music.
I don't want to fucking, they come up with the guitars and shit. It's like, look, man, I get that shit out of my face. I don't want to hear shit you got to say or play.
4 o'clock in the morning, the speakers were out in the street. The speakers were the size of the World Trade Center before 9/11. And when you called the police, the standard response was, quote, "Noise control is not a priority in your neighborhood." Well, thank you very much.
And then they said, you better learn how to salsa.
Well, believe me, I played every card. I would call up and say, "This is Rabbi Finkelstein." I figured that was my ultimate weapon.
I like the in your neighborhood part of that. It's like, look, there are places where you could live. If this was going on, sure, we'd be all over there. We'd be there in 30 seconds. But wash your heck, yeah.
Exactly right.
My response, there was a guy that lived behind us. I don't know if you can see I have a picture that he took many years ago. He passed away. He sadly did a drug called DMT. And he would take DMT every day, and he would go into his room, which had a massive PA system, and he was a guitar player, and he'd play along to the same 2 or 3 songs every time he walked in his room. And it would just shake the walls. It shook the walls actually throughout the building. And it was kind of a big ass building, and it was so annoying. So the only way we thought to combat him was to have a larger PA system. So at one point in time, we could power about a 500-seat nightclub with the system we had with subwoofers and those big, tall main speakers. and we're also guitar players with full stacks of amps, and we would like combat him with shaking the walls with our stuff, which
exactly. And I was the Jew in between both of you. 3,000 years of oppression. I would have to deal with these two fuckers. And I'm caught between them. I'll tell you. So I lived in the alley. So on top of everything else, I got the echo. So I would point up like 2 floors. There was let's just call it a DR family with their World Trade Center size speakers. All I hear for 6 months is da 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 da. You said 3 songs, so I got you. I wish to amend that. Salsa merengue is 1 beat. Da 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 da. Okay, so I'd say, please God, move. Please God, please move. Because in that neighborhood there was a very high turnover. People were moving in, moving out. Please God, move. One morning, it's quiet. I say, thank you, God. They moved. And guess what happened? Down there, 1 floor, somebody new moved in. 8 years.
No, I never had.
I don't want to compare it to the Holocaust. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Definitely never had that experience. My ex-wife and I did used to have a downstairs neighbor who I could take out my phone and Shazam his music pretty regularly. It never had any trouble picking it up. But
now I'm afraid to be loud. Like I was telling Ben, I was like, "Oh, dude, I'm afraid to turn music up."
Where you live, I wouldn't worry about it. Like
I was singing. I came in today singing, Ben, because I was in a decently good mood. And Elia, our old landlord, knocked on my door. She goes, "Hey, happy guy, I could hear you singing in the breezeway." I was like, "Oh, God, that must be too loud." So.
Well, but in the breezeway, I mean, it's not like she was saying I could hear you singing from the other, like the house.
I was getting loud. I thought nobody was around.
Yeah, I really
was like I was in the goddamn shower.
I really wouldn't worry about it. Where Jason's apartment is like there's no immediate neighbor at this point in the same building. There are very few other houses around there. There's actual. Like I remember when I was living by there was a point where the gate got stuck because there was actual tumbleweed. Like a Western, there was tumbleweed that was stuck in the gate. I think if you could be loud anywhere with a clear conscience, you could be loud there. But talking about different groups of people coexisted, which is as good a transition as we're going to get here. I am really curious. You mentioned, Norman, in your email, because I know in your book, in the first part of your book, you talk about affirmative action. You talk about some of the past, what had been the precedent on the use of affirmative action in college admissions until last week. And so I am curious. But since then, did you get a chance to look at this new ruling?
Well, the majority opinion and the concurring opinions. The majority opinion was written by Roberts. The concurring opinions were written by Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. And then the dissenting opinions were written by Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Elena Kagan signed on to the dissenting opinions, but she didn't write one. And in the majority, Amy Coney Barrett didn't write one. Altogether, it comes to 240 pages. I read it all, and now I'm rereading it because my style is, the first read is just to see where is this argument going, and you don't know where it's going until you're at the end. And the second read is to look at it critically and see what holds together and what doesn't. So I'm in the middle now. I'm near the middle of the second reading. I reread Roberts, I reread Ketanji Brown Jackson, and I'm halfway through Sotomayor, and then I have to get back to Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. And it's, I would say, it's a confused picture because in many ways they're talking past each other, and in other ways, there are arguments on both sides. There's no question in my mind about that. And then there's the third issue. Issue number one, they're talking past each other. Issue number two, there are credible arguments on both sides. And then issue number three is totally beside the point of the decisions, which is, what difference does this really make? Affirmative action, it affected about, as I understand, it affected about 2 to 3% of African Americans who are attending college. 3 out of every 5 colleges in our country don't even have affirmative action. And where a large number of African Americans attend college, like community colleges, they're just open admission. So then there's this separate question of, is this much ado about nothing? Which is to say, is it about elite and selective schools, which in the grand scheme of things don't have much of an impact on most minorities in our country? Obviously that's a totally separate question because they don't really address it, except for the claim repeatedly made by Ketanji Brown Jackson that affirmative action can, and does, I should say, can, does, and will have a big impact in reducing racial disparities. But I would say that's an assertion without evidence. There are many assertions that are made in these cases which are not evidence, they're just claims. And without going into the nitty-gritty right now, because we have to really start from the beginning. Without going to the nitty-gritty right now, there are many contradictions in what these folks are saying. One contradiction, I think, on the pro-affirmative action side, which is to say, Elena Kagan, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Sonia Sotomayor, one contradiction, in my opinion, is they keep saying that race is just one tiny factor in an admission decision, that it's just of really minuscule weight. So they'll say in North Carolina, because it concerns 2 schools, University of North Carolina, UNC, and Harvard, because the affirmative action programs in both schools were challenged. And they claim, let's say in the University of North Carolina, they use 40 different criteria. And of those 40 criteria, says Ketanji Brown Jackson, race is only one criterion of the 40, okay? Now, there seems to me a huge discrepancy between all the claims they make about the vital necessity of affirmative action on the one hand, and their claim on the other hand that in fact this affirmative action criteria of race only constitutes the tiniest fraction of the final decision whether to admit this or that student. If it's such a minuscule criterion, then how can you, on the other hand, claim that its repercussions, that is, abolishing it, its repercussions will be catastrophic? That doesn't compute. But I'm just pointing now to one claim. There are many issues that are raised, and then the question is how you, as the interviewers and me as the interlocutor, how to proceed. And I would suggest that to put the ball in your court, and you choose a point of departure, and I will do my best to sort out what's going on here.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the, I guess one thing that I think a lot of people might, be confused about is what this ruling even does, because I think a lot of people are under the impression that it means that there's no sense in which you can, you can consider race, you can be, conscious of race in college admissions, and I don't think that's actually exactly what it does. From what I've seen, it says, well, what you can't do is sort of say, just like, here are our 40 criteria. One of them is, that you're a member of an underrepresented group, so you get an extra point for that. As we're adding up points, says you can't do that. But it does say that there are, if you write an admissions essay and you're talking about the obstacles you've overcome, and and some of those have to do with race, that you're still allowed to take into account.
Yes, that's where I will get to in a moment, but that's where I felt they were talking past each other. So I'm going to get to that in a moment. You asked, what does the decision do and what doesn't it do, or what are its consequences and what are not its consequences? So you're going to have to allow me a brief excursus. That means aside, taking a circuitous journey. So let's go back to the original affirmative action decision. It was on Alan Bakke, who was a white male, and he brought his case against the University of California Medical School at Davis. So it's Davis Medical School. Davis Medical School, it had entering class of 100 students, and it reserved 16 places for designated minorities. And those 16 places were reserved for African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, and Asians. Those were the 4 categories. And it was a quota. It was self-identified as a quota. For 16 places, whites were not eligible. And Bakke brought a lawsuit saying that he was being deprived of his 14th Amendment right. The 14th Amendment speaks to what's called equal protection under the law. It's often abbreviated as the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution. And he said he was being denied his equal protection under the law because his application was superior to those of several minorities who were admitted under that quota system. So the case goes to the Supreme Court, and as has been said, the ruling of the court is, they call it fractured, because the court ruled, one, that the University of California Davis affirmative action program was unconstitutional because it had a quota system and therefore it denied equal protection under the law. On the other hand, the court ruled that affirmative action is permissible, but only under one circumstance. So, Justice Powell, Lewis Powell, wrote the majority opinion. It's complicated what happened. I'm not going to go into the details. And please don't start sending me 10,000 emails telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm talking about. I'm just not going to go into all the fine details. I'm giving you the general picture. Justice Powell decides as follows. He says there are 4 basic reasons why you might have affirmative action. Reason number 1, just to have what you might call a Bennington ad type class, that you should have variety of races in the class. So it's just strictly having racial representation. Powell says that's unconstitutional, clearly under the 14th Amendment, because it's not colorblind. Colorblindness is the famous interpretation of the 14th Amendment by Justice Harlan in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which we're not going to talk right now about. So he says just racial representation unconstitutional. A second possibility, he says, is affirmative action, which you'll all recognize, affirmative action to rectify for historical wrongs. So because of the historical injustices that African Americans have suffered, we should use affirmative action to rectify the historical wrong. Justice Powell says, no, we can't do that. He says, first of all, how far back are we supposed to go with historical injustice? Where is the beginning of this rectification process? Number 2, he says, it's the nature of American society. What he says, it's not a 2-class history. It's not just white oppressor and black oppressed. He said our history is a history of immigrants where different groups suffered oppression when they came here, and then they gradually worked out of their oppression and joined the majority in oppressing another group. So he says the Irish, the Italians, the Jews. So he says we can't know which groups should and shouldn't benefit from affirmative action if we use that standard, historical oppression. He also says we can't use the standard of current racial oppression as a grounds for affirmative action, because he says it's constantly changing. That groups which were, let's say, take the Bakke University of California Davis case. So they classified as one of the oppressed groups Asians. But now Asians are far outstripping any other minority, and majority, by the way, whites, in their academic performance.
Yeah, in a sense, right? I mean, like, I think my understanding is that Asians have the largest gap, within the group, between the poorest and the richest members, out of any racial group in the United States right now. So, some Asians are, and if you haven't, if you're just kind of putting it all in the statistical grinder, it looks like it.
I'm just looking now at the academic representation.
Yeah.
There is credible evidence that, say, at Harvard, if it were strictly meritocratic criteria that are used in the narrowest sense, SAT scores, grade point average, and so forth, Harvard would be 40% Asian now.
Mhm.
As of now, it's 20%, but it would probably double. At least that argument has been made, and it seems to be credible. In any case, for those reasons, which I've already stated, namely, where do we begin the historical oppression? Which groups do we include? And how do we deal with the fact that there's a constant shuffling of who is oppressed and who isn't? We have a whole, since Bhakti, there's been a whole bunch of new groups which are claiming oppression. And there are groups which have not much of a credible claim anymore. I would say South Asians, for example, Pakistanis, they're just doing fine academically. So their claim to rectifying historical oppression doesn't really seem to ring very true. Obviously, same applies to Jews. So to make that long story short, he rules out rectifying historical wrongs and trying to compensate for current racism. So that's 2 down. The third possibility is to have affirmative action because minorities are more likely to serve in minority neighborhoods. So the first Baki case was about doctors. It was medical school. And the claim was made that a minority going through medical school would more likely serve in an underserved minority neighborhood. Powell rules that out. He says there's no evidence that if you're black, you're more likely to serve in the black neighborhood. We should use your record of community service rather than your race as a proxy for your likelihood to serve in a poor neighborhood. And that left, so that's 3 down. Powell says no, no, no. And that left one possibility. And the one possibility was diversity. And namely, there is a educational value to having people of diverse backgrounds in a university because, it's the feely, touchy stuff. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I'm not going to argue at this point. But you get to learn about other people, and it breaks down stereotypes, and you learn to work together, so on and so forth. It's I would call it, for lack of a better term, it's the kumbaya version of affirmative action. And Powell says that's credible, and therefore we will allow for affirmative action, but we will limit it to only that use of affirmative action. And the reason for that is because any color or racial test, says Powell, along with several other judges, any racial or color test is in violation of that equal protection 14th Amendment. And so we have in the United States a concept called strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny simply means that if there is a statute, if there is a practice that's violating on its face the 14th Amendment, we have to look very closely whether that practice or that statute is constitutionally permissible. And for it to become constitutionally permissible, it has to meet 2 criteria. Criterion number 1, it has to serve a critical state interest. There has to be a real state interest in violating the 14th Amendment. And number 2, that your program for meeting this state interest has to be very narrowly tailored so that it's only serving that interest and not doing more harm. And Powell rules that diversity meets the strict scrutiny standard. Okay, now let's fast forward to the ruling last week. The ruling last week goes as follows. Justice Roberts focuses entirely on the question of diversity, and he denies that the Harvard or the UNC, University of North Carolina, the Harvard or the UNC programs, affirmative action programs, he denies that they serve the purposes of diversity. Why, I'll get to in a moment. The dissenters do something different. They claim that we have a society which is saturated with racial disparities, of which all of you know, everybody listening, and you two in particular, you know the whole story. Disparities in health, disparities in wealth, disparities in this, that, and the other. And they want to argue that affirmative action should be used to eliminate or help eliminate those disparities. Well, you can already see there's a problem here, because Roberts claims that Justice Powell already said you can't use affirmative actions to correct for historical wrongs. You can only use affirmative action for diversity. That's the only grounds, he said. And so they, Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor, are trying to effectively undo what Powell said in his opinion in the Bakke case. So I would say that it's hard to defend on legal grounds what Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor were arguing, that we can use affirmative action in order to help eliminate those racial disparities. So they have a weak case there. On the other hand, Justice Roberts wants to say, or does say, that diversity is not a legitimate grounds for affirmative action. Well, Powell said it was. So both of them are trying to undo the precedent. I think both of their cases are, at least in terms of the Bakke case, both of their briefs, opinions, are kind of weak. Now, having said that, I can continue and explain why.
I do want to switch gears a little bit here, because I mean, I went back and read the part of your book where you're talking about affirmative action, and it seemed like you were a little ambivalent there. Like I kind of came out of it feeling maybe a little bit unclear about what you thought should happen, right? I mean, not like maybe taking like a little bit of a step aside, from what the immediate legal arguments were here. And I do also wonder, I mean, kind of connected it to something that you said sort of at the beginning of your comments about this, about how you can question, once you take a step back from all of this, you can question what's really at stake in practice, right? So there's a article about this in the Atlantic by our friend Bertrand Cooper, who points out that It's the failure of affirmative action. And he says, for the black poor, a world without affirmative action is just the world as it is. That in other words.
Well, I'll just give you one example, and then I want to reach the practical questions and hear you. I want to hear you out. This is not a monologue, but just a practical example. Harvard has 600. I'm not going to say African Americans because that's the whole point. They don't have African Americans. 600 black people in their school right now. Of those 600, 200 are from Nigeria. There's a Harvard Nigerian Association, 200 members, which is to say 1/3 of Harvard's affirmative action diversity consists of Nigerians who are basically getting into Harvard because they belong to the ruling class in Nigeria and they bring a lot of money. Now you have to ask yourself a simple question. Does that speak to the purposes of affirmative action? I think it speaks to how to make Harvard rich.
Richer.
Bringing the sons and daughters of a very rich country, an oil-rich country, bringing them all to Harvard, claiming, look how enlightened and progressive we are, whereas beneath the veneer of being enlightened and progressive, it's a get-rich scheme for Harvard. I remember Brianna Joy Gray commented. She said, in her entering class at Harvard, there were 150 black students, which is right because it's 600 altogether. And she said of those 150, she said only 10% represented anything having to do with my background.
What does she mean by her background, though? She was black from
black from America. That's what she means, right?
America, from a modest background. Her father was a science teacher, I think a high school science teacher. Her mother did work for the UN as I think a psychologist, if my memory is correct. And she spent a lot of time out of the country. 8 years, she said, in her formative years. 8 years was spent outside the country. But she's coming from coming from the American South. And she was not part of the what was called back then. I don't know what's called now, the black bourgeoisie. That was not her background. And she said only 10%.
What were you saying before, Jason?
Bertram Cooper points out in that article, because he actually did a lot of work. He had to work with Harvard to get the whole thing published, and he actually wanted to pull records from there because he's been working on this. A book about this actually for quite some time, because he actually comes from a very black poor background where he went to high school. He was in the foster care system while he was in high school. His father was in prison for a large part of his life, and then his mother was just off doing her own thing. So the idea that Brianna Joy says, well, there's a lot of people that came from my background. It's like, well, you mean people that lived in Africa for 8 years of their life, like Mean Girls? Or do you mean, black working poor? Because I think that's only 3% of the population, and the white poor is definitely not represented at Harvard whatsoever. So his whole point of the piece is for the ending of affirmative, and he wrote this before the verdict came down, for the affirmative action to be over, for black and brown, poor people, that's just the world that they live in, or we live in. Nothing has changed. This does not mean anything to the majority of us. So yes, she is 100% right that Harvard went out and got, all these dignitaries' kids, and they have perfect racial representation because of that.
So go ahead. No, go ahead.
No. So the question around Harvard and elite institutions, is just kind of funny. I mean, not everybody with a 4.0 is getting into an elite institution, right? We all know that. Like this is really hard to get in. That's why they're elite institutions. Because
nobody would want a degree from Harvard if they weren't so rare.
There's a reason why Harvard and UMass are different schools.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, I mean, if they did, I mean, I wrote an article for Jackman a couple of years ago where I said I want to nationalize these universities, and it could be, we could make it UMass Cambridge, at which point it won't be special. It'll just be the UMass that people go to if they live close to there. But right now, like, one of the main purposes that's served by this school is to get to say, oh, I'm one of the tiny number of people who's a member of this club, who went to the school that almost nobody gets to go to, and that in itself, I think, maybe speaks to a limit of like the way that this is such a charged sort of way that people talk about racial justice or overcoming disparities, like Norm was mentioning about the dissents, that I think it might speak to the sort of unspoken class dimension of identity politics as it actually exists in the United States, that we end up focusing so much on what happens in these elite institutions.
Yeah, there's a certain segment of the Black population that through affirmative action got in better positions, but it's not like it lifted, a vast majority out of poverty. And I think that's where people are kind of missing the point a lot on this.
Well, I would have to say, I happen to respect Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think she's an impressive woman, very significant achievements, and she acquits herself with a lot of dignity and intelligence. And for me, it's deserving of respect. I was disappointed by her dissent. It was well written, very well researched, no question on those grounds. But I was a little disappointed that she adopted as her own that very limited vision of woke politics. Namely, we have to get rid of the disparities. As if to say, if every Black person can live like a white person, this country would be so wonderful. Well, for 80% of Americans...
live like which white people?
For 80% of Americans, if 80% of Black people live like the 80% of white people, it's no great shakes. And so to me, it bespoke a very limited, cramped vision of what is the desirable outcome for our country. Is it just to eliminate disparities so 80% are basically facing a futureless future? Is that the goal? So that to me was a bit of a disappointment. I would say that in the question, and I'll hear you out, I'll just lay out the arguments, and then I would be happy to hear from both of you how credible do you find the arguments that Roberts made against the diversity claim. So I'm going to just go through them 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll list one, and then you respond. So give you an opportunity to weigh in. So number one, Roberts says a lot of these goals, like we're learning to work together, we're learning to get over our stereotypes, we're learning to be future leaders in which we can get along with each other. He says these are such what he calls imponderable goals. There's no way to measure whether you're achieving something or you're not achieving something. Because in order to pass strict scrutiny, you have to show that if we're going to violate the 14th Amendment, the colorblind clause, as it's called, you have to show that something is being accomplished. And he says I'm using my terms now, not his. He says these kinds of feely-touchy criteria, learning to get along, learning to respect each other, and he says those are too imprecise, too imponderable to be a basis for an affirmative action program. I have to say, now here you can disagree with me. You can disagree with me on anything. I do have to say, I find it kind of like turning black people into animals in the zoo. Like, we have to learn how to get along with them. And that's why we have affirmative action. It leaves me uncomfortable, that kind of depiction of the purpose of affirmative action. The fact of the matter is, most white people have some interaction with black people virtually every day, whether it's on the subway, on the bus, somewhere in the workplace, you're the person at the post office, somewhere you're having interaction. I'm not sure if you really have much more interaction than college campus. College campuses can be awfully segregated places. If you ever go into the lunchroom in many college campuses or the dinner room, they're very segregated places. So that criterion, I kind of agreed with Roberts that that's too feely touchy. That's my term. Then he said the categories that are used to judge diversity. He says these categories are totally arbitrary. So there's one category called Asians, okay? But it makes no distinction between South Asians, like Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, and East Asians, like Chinese. They just have one lump category called Asians. And we have to have, for diversity, we have to have representation from Asians. Then he says there's another category, it's called Hispanics. But Hispanics include people from Spain. It includes people from Latin America. It doesn't include Brazil. So what is this category? And then he says there's whole groups which are not even part of diversity. For example, there's no Middle East category. So
under Asians?
No, that would be Egyptians, Iranians, Jordanians.
Yeah, aren't they all Asian?
No, they're Middle Eastern, and they don't pass in the Asian category. So he says all of these categories that are used are so arbitrary. And then he makes the point, which we've already mentioned. He says it includes somebody from an impoverished background in the South and a Nigerian head of state, the
dignitaries' kids.
Yeah. He says, is that a substantial category if it includes people so different in virtually every regard, except for being black? And then he says this whole notion of diversity is based on stereotypes. So it assumes if we have X number of blacks on campus, we'll have the black voice. But that assumes there's one black voice.
You didn't know that? It's Mahalia Jackson.
Right. Actually, I'll agree with that.
Was there a vote?
Yeah, we all voted for Mahalia Jackson, and
you could see how untenable that view is, because there are two African Americans on the Supreme Court now, and Justice Thomas devotes most of his concurring opinion to attacking Ketanji Brown Jackson, while Ketanji Brown Jackson replies that Justice Thomas obviously hasn't a clue what he's talking about. So I put in the margins, ouch. But that just belies the claim that having a black person on campus adds to the mix because it provides the black perspective.
But it's back to that whole thing about Brianna talking about no one's representing her. It's like, but what Black perspective are you getting, right? It's not the George Floyd Black perspective of someone that grew up in projects. It's the Black perspective of, even if you're in a Black American, you're fitting in with your Harvard friends. Ben and I, this is all anecdotal. Ben and I were at a friend's wedding. That's part of my show. And he went to Harvard, and all of his Harvard friends were there. None of them looked like, they were all white, and they were all pretty well-to-do. Like that hasn't really changed. And people that go to that school, you're putting yourself in elite company for a particular reason. I don't know why people feel like Harvard is Good Will Hunting is a movie. Like, let that shit go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first Robert's point, I think is pretty well taken. That I'm not sure that I think that trying to foster, like, what goes on in somebody's head, I don't think should necessarily be the goal of public policy. I'm concerned with what people have and if their material needs are being met and what kind of legal rights they have and all of that stuff. But, the thoughts in their head, I think that's, I think there's a limited amount public policy can do about it in the first place. And, and it's hard to know all of that stuff. All that stuff seems right. And most of the other objections, frankly, seem right too. I mean, if the goal is not diversity, but overcoming disparities, that's a better argument, but you can still, even though it goes against the original Powell decision you're talking about, but it's a better argument, although even there, if that was the goal, I would question whether the kind of affirmative action that existed before the ruling would really be an effective way of achieving it, because if the underlying disparity is about, it's not, the disparity is not that like fewer middle class and rich like Black kids go to college than middle class and rich white kids. That's not really the disparity, right? The disparity is who is in those categories in the first place, right? That who grows up in those backgrounds, who grows up in poverty. That's really the disparity. And I wonder if that really was the goal. If if affirmative action that was just based on family income level would be
this conversation can't happen.
That actually is perfectly, first of all, it's perfectly legal. The 14th Amendment and what's called Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it forbids discrimination for anyone who's Title VI, for anyone who's a recipient of federal funding, based on race, color, national origin, and then they added sex and religion. But there's nothing stops schools from having class-based affirmative action. In fact, there was an interesting article yesterday in the New York Times. The original place where the whole affirmative action became litigated, as I said, was University of California, Davis. And now Davis, I should say the medical school at Davis, they have adopted a affirmative action program based entirely on class. They eliminated race, and they substituted for it. If you come from a poor background, if you suffered growing up for this, that, or the other reason based on class factors, that's their affirmative action program. And interestingly enough, I was surprised to learn that even though a lot of folks are admitted on the basis of that affirmative action, a class-based affirmative action, they said that the MCAT scores did not only diminished marginally, which is to say they were able to find lots of poor kids who actually did well in their standardized exam, and they were admitted. So it's perfectly possible to make a class-based affirmative action program. And I think I'll tell you something. I teach Baki, or I taught Baki. Now I'm going to have to teach this new one, which I'm filled with dread because it's going to take so much work. to figure out how to present it. That's a separate issue. The students in my class, minority students, I teach at City University, so it's mostly first generation immigrant and African American students. Just a smattering of white students, 2 or 3 in a class of 30, 35. And I was surprised. Most of the minority students opposed affirmative action. They opposed it. And I think the feeling was, when you're a first generation immigrant or you're African American, most of your friends are not in college. This is a real achievement. And they're working hard. The students work hard. And they want to be rewarded for their effort. And they don't accept that you should be rewarded just for being a minority.
But isn't that part of a campaign that was extremely strong in the 80s? So, bringing back the Benetton ad that you brought up for some people that didn't remember. But for people that don't know, Benetton is a Gap-like company that sold earth tones in the 80s and had advertisements where there were multicultural ads all the time. But isn't everything you're saying right now kind of an internalization of a lot of the Reagan era talking points that we heard about the ideas of affirmative action and what was really happening? Because that's also what I heard I think it was just out of high school when Proposition 187 went down in California in like 1997. I think that happens. And I remember hearing the same things about people getting into these universities only because of filling racial quotas. And it happened in California in the 90s. It wasn't that long ago. People always look at where I'm from as some sort of liberal paradise that is somewhat recent. That California was blue. It gives us Reagan and Nixon, so let's not forget that.
Nixon and Schwarzenegger.
Yeah. Like I said, don't forget Reagan. There's a lot of wonderful right wingers that come from my beautiful state. But I feel like that is kind of a sad internalization of talking points that maybe even their family internalized from that era as well, because there was a lot of shame in that moment of what these programs meant and the way they were being presented, because you still have to have a certain level of like basic skills. It's not just like you're pulling any black person to go to these.
And one of the things that Norm mentioned earlier in the conversation is that something like 2/3 of colleges weren't using affirmative action.
3/5.
Okay, yeah. In the first place, which is sort of unsurprising, because most universities aren't trying to come up with like tiny ways to differentiate nearly equivalent candidates for a tiny number of spots. Most universities are trying to, make sure that you meet some academic qualifications, but I mean, but they're admitting most people who apply. I mean, I think, right? I mean, I'm open to being corrected about this, but I think that this is primarily a phenomenon of relatively elite universities, or at least relatively elite programs in other universities, because those are the cases where you have this huge pool of people who all check all of these boxes to be admitted. And to quote a friend of ours who, I don't know if he didn't say this in the public record, so I'll just quote him anonymously. It's like you get down to the point where you're rejecting people for chipped fingernails and things like that, right? That like because you have so many people who meet all of your standards, who are applying for the same tiny number of boxes, and that's where affirmative action is going to be the biggest deal. Is it those universities? And I also, I mean, this is also something that I guess gives me a little bit of pause about the whole discussion. This is something that Freddie DeBoer wrote something in his Substack about affirmative action. This is one of the points that he made, that both when we consider people who got in, who maybe would not have gotten one of those slots if not for affirmative action, and then somebody who's like a white kid who, let's say they didn't get in because that was something they didn't get a point for, because of affirmative action. Both of those people, just to be a little bit crass about this, are basically going to be fine. That they're not like
the backup school is still USC, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody's, there are very few people in the world who it's like, well, okay, if I don't get into Harvard, I guess I'll go to Lansing Community College.
That's not how that's working, right?
Yeah.
Let's be honest. There's also, it's funny you talk about the spots taken. I don't know if you guys remember the college admission scandal from a few years ago,
yes.
which sadly I felt like didn't get the amount of coverage that it really should have gotten, because one of the things was the guy that was kind of behind it, or one of the people that was behind it, had a whole program for helping underprivileged kids get into schools, and kind of, I wouldn't say it's cover exactly, but man, you're also a part of this whole thing that's hurting people that are on the cusp of getting in, that are poor and working class. They were losing their spots to people that were getting this kind of side door entrance. They weren't rich enough to be Jared Kushner rich, where your parents are going to get a building built in your name, right? They were paying still hundreds of thousands of dollars to get their kids in. What was it? Cal, USC. I don't even think there was any Ivies in it, right? Was Princeton one of them, or Columbia? I don't remember.
However, 5% of the applications, 5% are either legacies, meaning your parent attended, or big donors, like Jared Kushner's father, or athletes. So we have big donors, athletes, and faculty and staff children. They constitute 5% of applicants and 30% of those accepted.
Damn.
30% of those accepted on totally, completely unmeritocratic grounds. I mean, that is rich, or mommy's rich, or you're a good athlete, or you're a faculty and staff child. Now, here's an interesting fact about this Supreme Court decision. Do you know who went after the legacies exception to meritocracy the most? I was very surprised. Gorsuch.
Really?
I don't know why. I was just really surprised. Gorsuch was the one who devoted most of his concurring opinion to denouncing the special privileges of the rich. The only thing I could figure was he wanted to show up the hypocrisy of Harvard, that it pretends to be so liberal and so progressive, and we want to have black people in our school. Yeah, you're so liberal and you're so progressive that you tilt the whole playing field to serve the children of rich donors and legacy children. Yeah, so I was surprised. Sotomayor mentions it in passing, but the one who really ripped into that whole scandal, as today's headline, The Times, was that now there's a new campaign afoot. Since you got rid of affirmative action, let's get rid of legacies. And it'll be interesting to see whether that takes off. There are demonstrations at Harvard today to get rid of the legacy thing. So we'll see. Another thing which was, I won't call it troubling, I will call it the narrowness of vision of the so-called progressives. Do you know what one of Sotomayor's arguments was? One of her arguments was, if we have affirmative action, it'll make our military more efficient. And then, you know what her example was? Her example was, back during the war in Vietnam, all of the soldiers were black and the officers were white. And that was one of the reasons why it wasn't an efficient fighting force. So we can have more black people in the senior positions. Our armed forces will be.
So next time around, if we have a wildly unpopular imperialist war, then there's going to be less resistance to it from within the military.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Get these radical blacks out there with, we need more black 4-star generals. That's what we need.
I couldn't help but think, Justice Sotomayor, I don't think the problem with the Vietnam War was the army wasn't efficient enough. I could think of other problems with
You
that.
didn't read Spike Lee's, or not Spike Lee's book, the guy that wrote the book Bloods. Apparently that's what it was all about. Not enough black representation in the upper management in the flag.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another interesting fact was you could just feel the visceral hatred between these judges. So, justices. So I'll give you an example. Obviously, Sotomayor is completely out of control. She's out of control. She sort of reminds me of myself. But you can imagine, I wouldn't be a good fit for the Supreme Court. So, Justice Roberts, he makes one exception to his abolition of affirmative action. And that exception was what Ben already alluded to. He says that your race in and of itself should not be a factor in admissions. However, if you can demonstrate that overcoming a racial obstacle was a significant achievement in your life, you can write about it in your essay, and that would be legitimate grounds for admission. That is to say, it's not enough that you suffer, or it's not enough that you're of a racial group. You have to demonstrate some personal achievement in overcoming that racial identity, and then you can use that. So Sotomayor, she describes Roberts' single exception. She describes it as, quote, putting lipstick on a pig. But then, Sotomayor goes on to say, she says, now all of you reading this opinion, just forget about what Roberts said. You can use your same quotas through the essay. So she said, ignore everything he said. You can still have racial quotas. Just instruct people to talk about their race in their essay. Well, Roberts is very peeved at this, and he says, I don't think a dissenting opinion is the best place to look in order to interpret our opinion today.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're one of these 9 Ivy League educated philosopher kings who are empowered to overturn laws, then the only people whose will thwarts you are other members of that tiny group, right? That it's maybe not hard to see how they could end up annoying the shit out of each other. But I am,
there's a visible tension now.
Yeah.
Lena Kagan used to boast that she would go hunting with Scalia, who was the most conservative member of the court before he passed. But I think that's over. See, in my opinion, we disagree. What's basically happened is, if you look at the decisions in the 1970s, the Roe decision, the Bakke decision, those were the 2 critical decisions in the 1980s. They were what you might call the liberal litmus test. If you were a liberal, you were anti-Baki, and you were pro-Roe. That defined being a liberal. Each of those opinions, Roe and Baki, they were both compromise opinions. Roe doesn't legalize abortion. It doesn't illegalize abortion. It says up to the second trimester, it's legal. Once you enter the third trimester, it becomes illegal. It's a compromise. And as you know, the compromise was...
or at least states are allowed to make it illegal in the third trimester, right?
Right. Yeah. The compromise was when the viability, it's called, when the fetus was viable outside the mother's womb. Baki was also a compromise because it doesn't say you can use affirmative action for everything, but you can use it for one thing, diversity. Now, in the two most recent, well, there have been several, but for our purposes, the two most recent decisions, namely overturning Roe and overturning affirmative action, there's no compromise. There's none. No compromise at all. It's gone, finished, except for that tiny little exception with the essay question, which is really kind of a footnote if you look at the whole opinion.
Yeah.
So then you have to ask yourself what's happening. And I think since the court is basically a barometer of public opinion, it's not a legal body in any meaningful sense, because if every decision is 6-3, 6-3, 6-3, and 6-3, it's obviously divided politically. It has nothing to do with the law. And every decision that just came down, whether it was on abolishing student tuition,
student debt, there's the student debt forgiveness policy that Biden had. Yeah, right. Yep.
The website designer decision, the affirmative action, they're all 6-3. So obviously, if you can predict decisions by virtue of the politics, it's not a legal decision, it's a political decision. It's your politics are the driver, not your apprehension of the law. But the question is, what happened such that in the 70s decisions, we had attempts at compromise, which actually held for a very long time. And now that's gone. And I think the answer is, given that the court is a barometer of public opinion, it's the fact that there's no middle in our politics anymore. It's become very polarized. And so the court is no longer trying to seek out a middle ground that will more or less satisfy pretty much everyone except the margins. Now it's either my way or the highway. And I think that's a reflection of the current political scene,
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't think this really contradicts your point, but I mean, I would say it's always been a political...
it's always been. I mean, one of the things about the Supreme Court decisions is they are so awfully argued. I mean, it's breathtaking how terrible. I teach it. I know it. I read it. I'll give you an example, which is fruitful to look at. So the most famous court decision, what they like to call the Mona Lisa of Supreme Court decisions, is the Brown decision overturning segregation. Okay? If you've actually read the decision, it's probably the worst decision ever argued by the court. It is so bad that it kind of it fills you with wonder at how awful a decision can be issued by the court unanimously. The whole decision is just 11 pages. 11 pages. Now, what is the essence of the decision? I'll get to the conclusion first, and then I'll get to the argument. The famous conclusion of Brown, which everybody quotes very proudly, that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Okay? Notice it doesn't say segregated educational facilities are inherently unequal. It says separate. Well, a moment's reflection will tell you that's a completely idiotic statement. You're telling me that a woman's school, be it Smith, Holyoke, or any of the other what used to be called the Seven Sisters, they were separate schools for women, okay? Or take the historically black colleges, Morehouse, Howard, Atlanta. Are you telling me that they are inherently unequal to white schools? Does that statement make any sense on a moment's reflection? Completely idiotic. And everybody keeps repeating it without even a moment's reflection that that statement makes no sense. Of course, a women's school can be equal to a men's school, and a black school can be equal to a white school if they have the same endowments and they have the same quality students coming in with the same privileged backgrounds. Of course, they can be equal. Number two, what was the main grounds? What was the main grounds that Warren, who wrote the decision, or the Brown decision, what was its main grounds for declaring segregation inherently unequal? What was the main grounds? Okay, let me just quick foundation. What happened with Brown was, as you guys probably know, for decades, the NAACP and other organizations were fighting the Plessy decision on the grounds that Plessy said, so long as facilities are equal, they are constitutional. So if black schools are of equal quality, the buildings, the teacher salary, and all, if they're equal to white schools, then they're constitutional. So for decades, the NAACP fought Plessy by trying to equalize the quality of black schools, namely saying, obviously, 1/10 of the money being invested in the white school is being invested in the black school. Under Plessy, that's illegal because our facilities are not equal, and therefore you have to give us more money. So they were trying to equalize the facilities. Finally, they gave up, and they adopted the new strategy. The new strategy was to prove that even if the facilities were equal, even if black schools were equal in terms of investment in infrastructure, salaries of teachers, that even if they were equal, then they would still be unconstitutional, even if they were equal. Why? Because segregation is inherently inflicting on minorities, in this case African Americans, an inferiority complex. So what Brown was, it took four school districts in which the facilities were almost equal to the white schools in the same school district. They were equal. And Brown sought to prove that if they were equal, they would still violate the Constitution. How did it violate the Constitution? Well, I told you a moment ago. Because segregation inherently produces an inferiority complex among African Americans. Okay? That's the claim. Is that true? I think the answer is obviously not. I'll give you an example. And then argue with me. Because frankly, I'm already tired of talking. Argue with me. Okay? My parents grew up in Poland. All right? Mm-hmm. Poles did not like Jews. They didn't like Jews. Period. Full stop. Jews went to separate schools. My mother went to a Jewish school. She wouldn't think of going to a school with non-Jewish Poles. Okay? So, did my mother walk out of that experience with an inferiority complex? Forget it. Her whole life she had just complete and total contempt for Poles. She never said a Polish person. She just said, a stupid Pole, a stupid Pole, a stupid Pole. I'm not proud to say it. I'm just trying to illustrate a point. I was not happy when she did that, and there's a lot to talk about there, but I'm not going to now. What's my point? Segregation doesn't inherently produce an inferiority complex. That's just not true.
I mean, if you look at the history, if you look at the history of historically black universities, especially after the GI Bill, that's when they blow up because so many black people aren't getting into the Harvards of the world. So the people that are able to use the GI Bill, I mean, there becomes this almost waiting list to get into historically black universities. And when we see the end of that, and especially during the 80s, you know, it damn near took Bill Cosby and his shows to have a resurgence of young.
You raise a very interesting point.
Mm-hmm.
Because Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion, he focuses in no small part on how many outstanding graduates there are from the HCBUs. And it goes through it in quite in considerable detail. And I'm thinking to myself, Justice Thomas, do you not realize that you have just disproven the central finding of Brown? Brown said separate educational facilities can never be equal. And
Thomas, I mean, I don't know how much Thomas would object to that in the sense that, I mean, he's, I mean, I think he does have a general tendency towards sort of, you know, bemoaning the effects of integration. I mean, I actually think so. Corey Robin has written interesting stuff about the way that Justice Thomas actually comes originally, if you look at his political background,
Black nationalist.
Yeah, exactly. Before he was a conservative, right? He was a black nationalist, and I think that, you know, I think there's a lot of sort of fair enough. Before he was what we usually mean by conservative, he was a black nationalist, and there's certain things he's retained from that. And I think that the idea that there's sort of that you know, black people are better off, you know, in you know, like a, you know, separate institutions and stuff like that, you know, is maybe a through line in his thinking. I mean, I certainly take your like larger point, going back to the original thing, that they have look, I'm really happy the court, you know, ruled the way that it did, you know, Brown, because everybody should be able to go wherever they want, you know, but it's not that the justices who write these decisions have some, you know, direct line through God to the spirit of James Madison or whatever. They're political actors, you know, maybe in the 70s, as Nora was saying, they're political actors who have incentives, given the way the political landscape is, to sort of try to craft more consensus-y, compromise decisions, and now the political incentives have changed. But, you know, you certainly, you know, look at this string of decisions, you know, affirmative action, whatever we think that the, you know, right outcome, you know, should have been there, you know, but I mean, certainly was one that reflects conservative political preferences. Student loan forgiveness, where actually looks like they diverged from what a strict textualist would do, because they said, well, okay, technically the law that Biden was using did give him the authority, but you know, they used the major questions.
I haven't yet read that.
Yeah, so they basically, what they said, as I understand it, was essentially, well, anything that's as big a use of that authority as this was probably not contemplated by Congress, so we're still going to rule it, you know, unacceptable. And, you know, you can presumably, any constitutional lawyer worth their salt could come up with an argument for or against any of these. You know,
totally agree. It's so arbitrary and so unconvincing and so transparently political. It's almost, I don't want to inspire patriotism in my students, but it's almost embarrassing when you start I actually put the whole decision on the projector and we go through it paragraph by paragraph. It's actually embarrassing how poorly they're argued, these decisions. Roe was a complete disaster. Brown was a complete disaster. Bakke wasn't terrible. The arguments were weighty on both sides. I thought Bakke was okay. Even the one that everyone loves to quote Justice Harlan in the Plessy decision. So Plessy says, separate can be equal as long as it's equal, as long as they're equal, it's constitutional. And every single person, every single justice in the current opinion, they all quote Justice Harlan saying that our Constitution is colorblind and there can't be any case in our in our system. And everybody is so ennobled by Harlan standing up for the principle of equality before the law and redeeming that otherwise unredeemable Plessy court, which ruled separate can be equal. So what did Harlan actually say? Go back. It's worth looking at even after the program. Harlan said that, yes, it's unconstitutional to segregate people according to race. And then he goes on to say, white people have been the dominant race in this country since the beginning, and it is my opinion they will remain the dominant race into the future if we just abide by the principles of the Constitution. So what was Harlan, the great liberal, actually saying? He was saying, white folks, you have nothing to worry about. We're superior to them. We're smarter than them. And even if you give them formal equality, our dominance is going to remain. And everybody leaves that part out. It's just the wonderful, terrific, fantastic Harlan who redeems all of our liberal virtues and values.
Yeah, so I do want to, even though we're coming up to time, there is just one last thing that I think we haven't really covered that I feel remiss if we didn't mention at least briefly in talking about all this, which is so Norm, earlier you were talking about all these sort of other exceptions to meritocracy in college, elite college admissions, legacies, and athletics, and et cetera, right? And you also mentioned your Black and brown students who didn't like affirmative action.
I have to be careful about that because I want to report facts as they are and not as I wish them to be. Most of my African American students, I teach in City University.
Yeah.
Most of them are Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
And Caribbeans, they come from a different place. And there is a very different record of academic performance Thomas Sowell has written extensively on it, comparing the academic performance of Caribbeans, which apparently is pretty spectacular, according to Sowell. I only know it secondhand because he's cited.
Yeah.
When I said the students are against it, it's mostly Caribbean
immigrants, sure, yeah. Second generation immigrants, maybe, yeah. So, but this is the larger point that I do worry a little bit. Maybe this sort of should go without saying, but I do worry a little bit that it's very easy in this conversation to get sucked into sort of accepted background premises that everybody in the mainstream conversation accepts that perhaps we shouldn't. So it's, like, it's surely not the case that what we actually want is a really consistent meritocracy. That in other words, that's like, as long as it's really the best and the brightest rising to the top, then everything's fine. Since it's still, if it's, if you have a hierarchical economic structure, and even if the people at the top really, really earned it or whatever, that still leaves most people out of the cold, right? I mean, like a sort of a meritocracy that's truer to its ideals would still be, a wildly unequal society.
Well, there are many things to say to that, and you saved it for the last question. Let me just make 3 comments.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, in my youth, I was a Maoist.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened that I wrote my senior thesis in college on Mao Zedong's approach to higher education. And there was a very distinct preference given in China under Chairman Mao. There was a very strong preference given to children who were sons and daughters of workers and peasants. This was completely undisguised. We're living in a dictatorship with the proletariat, and this proletariat is going to be in those elite universities, not the sons and daughters of the bourgeoisie. So I actually have to say part of me still resonates to that idea, that there should be a preference given to those who have created in backbreaking ways the wealth of our society. So I don't want to say I've completely discarded that idea in favor of a categorical meritocracy. The 2 things I would say are, the 2 qualifications I would make are, I do believe that everyone can benefit from a college education. Now, I was talking the other day to the porter in my building, and I asked him if he attended college, and he said no. And he said, I wasn't cut out for college. It wasn't for me. I was more of an active person. And of course, that caused me to pause and wonder, well, maybe I am being too broad in my generalization. But it's been my experience, having taught a very wide range of students, that if you're a good professor, if you're committed to your students, if you're committed to your job, you can engage everybody in the world of ideas. And so even in a meritocratic system, I would still say there should be room for everyone to have that opportunity to realize that faculty in their mind, for whom a lot of them it's laying dormant. And here's an opportunity. So however hierarchical a meritocracy might be, I still believe the foundation, everybody should have a right to college. Now, I would say further that that's much more true now than in my generation, because most people entering college now, this is not an exaggeration. You have to have the value, you have to have the advantage of time. I went to school in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Most people entering college now do not have a basic high school education when I went to school. So when we're talking about giving everybody the opportunity for college, what we're really talking about is giving everybody the opportunity for high school. That's a fact. Do you know how many students walk into my class never having read a book? You hear me? never having read a book. Do you know how many students walk into my class never having written a paper? They just don't know what it is. In my school, now I admit I was in the top classes, not because I was a genius, but because I worked very hard. In my school, in my junior year, we had 6 majors: history, English, language, math, science, and one other, depending on who you were, one other, okay? Just in my English class, we read 1 or 2 novels a week. Just English, one major. So, for example, The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, we read them both in 1 week. That was the assignment. The only book we were allowed 2 weeks for was Herman Melville's Moby Dick. That was it. That was it. We had to write an essay every night. Every night we had to write an essay. That's what high school was in my day. And now when people talk about, paying for college, why should they get college free? Well, we had high school free, and this is just high school for these students. High school was free for us. It was public school. Listen to this. College was free. If you were in City University of New York, free. State University of New York, it was a token tuition, which was covered by what was called the Regents Scholarship. It was free.
University of California used to be free.
Yep.
Rob Reiner, when he debated Bill Maher on this issue, he said, when I went to UCLA, it was $238 a year. They were basically free. So there are 2 points. Basically, college is now just a high school education in my day. And number 2, even if it were more than high school, colleges were free in my day. So I don't think there are any grounds for denying any student, if he or she so chooses, to attend a college. On the other hand, that's the foundation. On the other hand, there are always going to be a limited number of spaces for the more selective schools. That comes with the turf. And there, I believe, meritocratic criteria should be applied with the caveat, with the exception that there should be class-based considerations. It's simply wrong. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. If one student is prepping for the SAT beginning in 2nd grade, and many, many students have come over to me and said they didn't even know until they were in their senior year what an SAT was.
Yeah.
That's just not fair.
Well, I think what you're putting your finger on here is a lot of what frustrates me about this discussion, because, we spend all this time sort of, I don't want to sort of give short shrift to the substantive issues that are at stake, but there is a level in which we spend all this time thinking about, essentially which extremely privileged kids get those couple thousand slots at Harvard. And, I wish the sort of political, larger national argument about this would spare a little bit more thought for the other, 30 million or so people 18 to 24 who don't go to Harvard. But that was very good. I really liked that final note there, Norm. I should say your book, for people who haven't read it, is called I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. There's a lot that's in here that we haven't really touched on either in this or the previous conversation. So I'd love to have you back to do that. But thank you so much as always for your time.
Now, are you two a team now?
No. Jason's, I mean, you know.
Yeah, routine. It's like a Lethal Weapon.
Okay. Yeah, no, I am very much like that guy. That's you know.
But it's reversed, and I'm the Mel Gibson character, and he's the Danny Glover guy.
I see.
Did you see my most recent interview with Brianna?
I haven't.
I saw you guys did a live thing.
Yeah, at a bookstore.
Okay.
I did. Of course, I wasn't there, but yeah, I saw. No, I haven't seen your most recent interview.
It went well. It went well. I was happy.
She's your new favorite black person. Just a minute. Just a minute.
Oh, one of the things I like about Brianna is she rises above being black. She's
okay.
And I don't.
Not like Jason.
No. She's in my opinion the best podcaster. I don't.
Oh my God.
I don't put a.
Well, tell her that I'm going to have an arm wrestling competition with her, and we'll settle this the old-fashioned.
We'll decide
who is the best black podcaster.
No, I don't care, black podcaster.
Well, I do, Norm. We're in a race-based society, and we're going to make everything about color, and then we'll have a gender-based.
So you think W.B. Du Bois was the best black historian?
From 1910 to 1935, and then you have to give it to Monroe Trotter.
There we go.
I think Monroe Trotter was dead by then. I'm just kidding.
Well, you know, as long as I can be the best melody deprived podcaster, that's what really matters here. The best melody deprived, white, podcaster. But in any case, I really do appreciate it. Come back soon. Norman Finkelstein, author of I'll Burn That Bridge when I get to it. Always fun to talk to. Always unpredictable. Always enjoy that. Meanwhile, we are going to go to the post game for patrons. If you're a patron, you should already have that link. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgis. And I don't know, talk about silly shit, I guess. That seems like the appropriate use for post game.
I think if you're going to talk about silly shit, do it behind a paywall so you can't get in trouble.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
See who really wants to hear how far down a depravity rabbit hole we can all go. So
yeah, no, that sounds good to me. We'll also do a top 10 list of the white podcasters, specifically. anybody who is curious about that. So
I want to. Yeah, that'd be a fun list to make. A white.
Yeah.
Was it me and you sitting around trying to figure out who are the women podcasters, and we can only think of like 4 people? Was it me and you doing that?
That sounds like a conversation we might have had. I do not specifically remember that, but in any case, we'll go to the post game, figure out best white podcasters, best Jewish podcasters. I don't know, the 2 or 3 women who do it, whatever. We'll rank everybody. So something to look forward to there. We'll see you if you're a patron. We'll see you back there in about 90 seconds. Left is best.